This is a yoroi, also known as a samurai armor.
Do you wear it?
Never.
Where did you get this?
Rick Harrison had spent decades behind the counter of the gold and silver pawn shop. Across those years, thousands of people had walked through the front door carrying objects they believed would change their lives. Some brought forgotten paintings rescued from dusty attics. Others arrived clutching military medals, pirate coins, Civil War rifles, celebrity memorabilia, or family heirlooms wrapped carefully in blankets that had protected them for generations. Every owner carried the same hope, that today would be the day an ordinary object revealed an extraordinary secret. Most of the time, reality was less dramatic. A family treasure worth $50 often carried more emotional value than financial worth. A supposed lost masterpiece usually turned out to be an excellent reproduction. History, Rick had learned, was filled with beautiful stories, but genuine miracles were incredibly rare. Yet every so often, history refused to follow the rules. Sometimes it walked quietly through the front door disguised as something completely ordinary. One afternoon, beneath the harsh Nevada sunlight, a middle-aged man stepped inside carrying a long wooden crate wrapped in an old military blanket. There was nothing flashy about him. No television cameras followed his entrance. No dramatic announcement echoed through the store. Customers continued browsing display cases while employees helped buyers inspect jewelry and vintage firearms. The man simply waited his turn. His name was David, and without realizing it, he was carrying an object that would force everyone inside the shop to rethink everything they believed about hidden treasures. Because this wasn't merely a piece of antique armor. If the evidence proved true, it represented a surviving witness to one of the bloodiest periods in Japanese history. Before we uncover what happened next, stay with us, because the greatest mystery wasn't the helmet itself. It was how something of unimaginable historical importance could remain hidden inside an American family for nearly 80 years without anyone recognizing what they possessed. When Rick invited David to the counter, he immediately noticed the careful way the crate was handled. People carrying expensive collectibles often displayed nervous excitement. David looked different. He seemed uncertain. "I inherited this from my grandfather," he explained while gently removing the weathered blanket. "He brought it home after World War II. Inside rested what appeared to be an old Japanese samurai helmet. Its iron surface showed centuries of wear. The lacquer had faded almost completely. Leather cords had darkened with age, while tiny patches of rust hinted at countless decades spent resting inside storage boxes rather than museum displays. To an untrained eye, it looked valuable, but not extraordinary. David admitted he knew almost nothing about Japanese history. His grandfather had rarely spoken about the war. The helmet simply sat inside a closet for decades before eventually passing through the family after his grandfather's death. A few collectors had suggested it might be worth somewhere between $10,000 and $15,000, depending on its condition. For many families, that would already be life-changing money. Rick nodded thoughtfully. "I've bought Japanese military items before," he said. "Samurai armor always has a market, especially if it's authentic. But there's a huge difference between authentic and historically important. That difference often determined whether an item sold for a few $1,000s or became completely priceless." Rick carefully lifted the helmet onto the inspection table. Immediately, something caught his attention. The construction felt unusual. He had handled dozens of samurai helmets throughout his career. Most followed recognizable patterns. This one didn't. The iron plates appeared thicker than expected. The rivets seemed handmade rather than standardized. The decorative crest had been removed centuries earlier, leaving behind mounting holes unlike anything Rick remembered seeing before. He leaned closer. Tiny hammer marks covered the metal. Not damage, craftsmanship. Each strike reflected the individual movements of a blacksmith whose work predated modern machinery by hundreds of years. Rick remained silent for several seconds. Years in the pawn business had taught him that instincts mattered. Sometimes an object simply felt different, and this helmet felt different. "What exactly do you know about where your grandfather got it?" Rick asked. David shook his head. "Only family stories. According to relatives, David's grandfather served in the Pacific during the final months of World War II. Following Japan's surrender, Allied forces encountered abandoned estates, military headquarters, and aristocratic residences filled with cultural artifacts. Somewhere during that period, the helmet entered his grandfather's possession before eventually traveling across the Pacific to America. No receipts, no military paperwork, just family history. Normally, that would make authentication difficult. But something else rested inside the crate. David carefully unfolded an aged sheet of rice paper covered with elegant Japanese calligraphy. "I found this wrapped inside the helmet." Rick's eyes narrowed. Documents changed everything. Objects could be copied. Paper trails were far harder to fake, especially handwritten ones surviving for centuries. Although Rick couldn't read Japanese, he immediately recognized that the brush strokes appeared remarkably old. The paper itself had yellowed naturally. Its edges had become brittle with age. Even the scent carried that unmistakable smell of ancient archives rather than modern reproductions. Now Rick's curiosity transformed into genuine excitement. He examined every visible detail without touching the fragile document directly. The writing extended from top to bottom in neat vertical columns, accompanied by what appeared to be seals impressed with faded red ink. If authentic, this wasn't merely paperwork. It was history speaking across generations. Still, experience demanded caution. Rick had seen convincing fakes fool experienced collectors before. Japanese antiques attracted sophisticated counterfeiters because genuine examples commanded extraordinary prices. One mistake could cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Or worse, damage the reputation he'd spent decades building. He slowly placed the helmet back onto its stand. "You know," Rick said quietly, "I think we're way beyond guessing." David looked confused. Rick continued, "This deserves someone whose entire career has been studying Japanese armor." The atmosphere around the counter subtly changed. Employees nearby sensed Rick's unusual seriousness. Customers drifted closer without realizing why. Even Chumli, accustomed to Rick's reactions after years of filming, noticed that this wasn't ordinary curiosity. Rick wasn't smiling. He wasn't negotiating. He was thinking hard. Because the more he examined the helmet, the more one uncomfortable possibility entered his mind. What if this wasn't simply a samurai helmet? What if it belonged to someone history had never expected to see again? If that were true, every minute the artifact remained exposed increased the risk of accidental damage. Rick reached for his phone. "There is one expert," he said. "If anyone can tell us exactly what we're looking at, it's him." What nobody inside the shop realized was that the expert's arrival wouldn't simply identify an old helmet. It would completely rewrite the story everyone believed they were witnessing. And before the day ended, a quiet family heirloom would begin transforming into one of the most astonishing historical discoveries ever to pass across the gold and silver pawn shop counter. The call reached one of the country's most respected specialists in Japanese arms and armor, a man who had spent more than 3 decades studying artifacts from feudal Japan. Museums sought his opinion before acquiring important collections. Private collectors trusted him with treasures worth millions. He had authenticated everything from ceremonial swords to battlefield armor, yet Rick noticed something unusual the moment the expert walked into the shop. He wasn't curious. He was cautious. Experts who spent their lives around history learned to manage expectations. 99 times out of 100, exciting family stories collapsed under close examination. Dates didn't match. Materials were wrong. Signatures belonged to later copies. Legends often proved more valuable than the objects themselves. But as soon as the expert's eyes settled on the helmet, he stopped walking. For several silent seconds, he said absolutely nothing. The entire shop seemed to grow quieter. Rick had witnessed that reaction before. It wasn't the look of someone trying to impress a television audience. It was the expression of a historian encountering something deeply unexpected. Without touching the helmet immediately, the expert leaned forward and slowly circled the inspection table. His attention focused first on the iron plates, then the rivets, then the weathered silk cords. Finally, he studied the unusual pattern where the missing crest had once been mounted. Only then did he put on a pair of white cotton gloves. "May I?" he asked. David nodded. The expert lifted the helmet with remarkable care, almost as though he feared centuries of history might crumble beneath careless hands. Instead of looking at the outside first, he examined the interior. That surprised Rick. Most buyers admired appearance. Scholars searched for evidence. Inside the helmet, faint brush marks remained visible beneath layers of aged lacquer. Tiny symbols